Good day everyone. This is video lesson in ITEP 101 or Human to Computer Interaction. This video lesson will cover the second part of Module 3, which is the lesson entitled Prototyping. The topics here include what is prototyping, low fidelity and high fidelity prototypes, and then we'll go into details about low fidelity prototypes and then high fidelity prototypes. So what is prototyping? Prototyping is an experimental process where the design teams implement ideas into tangible forms from paper to digital. Teams build prototypes of varying degrees of fidelity to capture design concepts and test on users. With prototypes, you can refine and validate your designs so your brand can release the right products. For us to better understand the concept, let's watch this video on prototyping.
We can't all be first-time lucky. Usually we make things happen through trial and error. That's where prototyping comes in. It's a way of developing, testing, and improving an idea before sending it out into the world. You design it, review it in a real-life scenario, and work out how to improve it. Then you do it all over again until you know it really works. It's a low-cost, low-risk way of making sure a product or a service has been test-driven before it's ready to be scaled up. It saves innovators and stakeholders time and money, so only the best version of something goes forwards. Prototypes have always been used to test products in tech and engineering, but it's also used to stimulate innovative ideas in the public sector. At Nesta, we've used prototyping to explore questions like, what would happen if there were contactless donation points in public parks? Or how can museums use technology to engage new audiences? We've created practical toolkits on prototyping, and we've funded innovators to make their own prototypes so they can test out ideas that will change the world for good.
So now let's discuss about the remarkable reasons for prototyping. So there are several reasons that I am going to discuss with you. But we have to know that prototyping is the later phase of both design thinking and design sprints. It's an essential part of user experience or UX design that usually comes after ideation, where you or your team have created and selected ideas that can solve users' needs. In prototyping, you craft a simple experimental model of your proposed product so you can check how well it matches what users want through the feedback they give. You should consider prototyping from early on using paper prototyping, if appropriate, so the feedback you gather from users can help guide development. The advantages of prototyping are the following. You have a solid foundation from which to ideate towards improvements, giving all stakeholders a clear picture of the potential benefits, risk, and cost associated with where a prototype might lead. Second, can adapt changes early, thereby providing or avoiding commitment to a single, falsely ideal version, getting stuck on local maxima of user experience and later incurring heavy costs due to oversights. Third, show the prototype to your users so they can give their feedback to help pinpoint which elements or variants work best and whether an overhaul is required. Next, you have a tool to experiment with associated parts of the user's needs and problems. Therefore, you can get insights into less obvious areas of the user's world. Next, provide a sense of ownership to all concerned stakeholders, therefore fostering emotional investment in the product's ultimate success. And then lastly, improve time to market by minimizing the number of errors to correct before product release. Prototyping is an integral part of the design process for two key reasons. First is for visualization. Prototypes help user experience designers show stakeholders how the final product would look and function. And the next, feedback, where the prototypes generate feedback from team members as well as the test groups of users. Potential customers can interact with a near final product and highlight areas that are less than user friendly. The design team can then iterate the design before the product team rolls out the final product, saving the company both time and money. So here's another video on prototyping. So let's watch this video.
Prototypes have been a part of the UX design process for quite a while now, but it hasn't been long that they got the attention that they truly deserve. So let's start with a short definition of what a prototype is. It's a simulation of a real product that is used for testing and gathering feedback, giving users a much more involved experience. It can be a low-fidelity or a high-fidelity prototype, or, if you ask me, everything in between, because its main purpose is to simulate the end product. You might be thinking, what is a low-fidelity or a high-fidelity prototype? If we want to keep it short, a low-fidelity prototype is the most basic prototype that only has sketches, and it's focused on clarifying the main flow of the product without taking in consideration any visual element. On the other hand, in a high-fidelity prototype, you will need to have the finished UI design, and it has to have the UX logic that you would like to see in the developed product. Basically, it's a dummy version of the end product because it doesn't have any code in the background. So where does a prototype fit into a product making process? Well, it depends on how detailed we want our product to be when we test it. You can create a basic prototype out of wireframes so that the main steps are obvious to the users and the test group. Or you can prepare a prototype just before the development starts so that it can be as detailed as you want the final product to be. If we take a look at only the financial part of the project, we can immediately tell that starting the development process after the design is approved costs more than if we would invest in prototype. That's because any changes in the development process can take up more time and effort to correct than it does in a prototype. Don't get me wrong, you won't spend less on development with a prototype, but you will save the extra change requests that raise the costs of the final product. If you leave out prototyping and start asking for changes in the development phase because you imagine that the UI would work differently, well, then you should count upon having extra work hours, and that will increase your estimated costs. After all changes have been approved and everybody is satisfied with the prototype, only then I'd recommend to start developing. It will save you time, money, and a lot of headache down the road.
So that's another video that introduces our next topic, which is a comparison between low fidelity and high fidelity prototypes. So what are these two? Fidelity refers to the level of detail and functionality you include in your prototype. Usually, this will depend on your product's development stage. You can construct one that gives a wide view of the entire system or subsystem, called a horizontal prototype, or one that gives a detailed view of just one feature, that is what we call a vertical prototype. The level of fidelity you choose should be appropriate for presenting to users in user testing so they can give focused feedback. So now let's discuss about low fidelity prototype. An example of a low fidelity prototype is paper prototype. The pros of low fidelity prototypes are the following. It is fast and cheap, it is disposable, easy to make changes and test new iterations, it allows a quick overall view of the product, anyone can produce them, and it encourages design thinking since prototypes are visibly not finalized. While the cons is that it lacks realism, so users might have a hard time giving feedback. It is hard to apply results from crude early versions. It may be too basic to reflect the user experience of the finished product. and can oversimplify complex issues. It lacks interactivity, depriving the users of direct control, and users must imagine how they would use the product. This is an example of a low fidelity prototype. This is an example of sketches. So in low fidelity prototypes, you can just use basic materials or tools such as pen and paper. So this is another example where you have a sample uh, hardware using cheap materials as well. Now let's talk about the high fidelity prototype. So an example of a high fidelity prototype are digital prototypes created on software such as Sketch or Adobe XD. What are the pros of high fidelity prototype? It is engaging, meaning all stakeholders have the vision realized in their hands and can judge how well it matches users' needs and solves their problems. Testing will yield more accurate, more applicable results, and the versions are closest to the final product that enables you to predict how users will take to it in the marketplace. While the cons, so the first one is longer and costlier to create. Users are more likely to comment on superficial details than on content. After hours of work, you, the designer, are likely to dislike the idea of making changes, which can take considerable time. Users may mistake the prototype for the finished product and form biases. So this is an example of a high fidelity prototype. Okay, so here you have the look and feel of the actual product on the platform itself or the software itself. In this case, this is an example of a mobile app high fidelity prototype. This is another example. Some designers split high-fidelity prototyping into mid-fidelity, where the prototypes can have basic digital interactivity or be sleek wireframes, and high-fidelity, where they are far closer to the final version. Interactive prototypes yield far more useful results in the user test. However, fidelity is relative. A static mock-up of a landing page, for example, is of higher fidelity than sketch cutouts users can move. Overall, you should always commit to prototyping with the user's needs in mind, particularly with an eye for user flow. So the goal of low-fidelity prototype is to outline a product's flow and test the usefulness and usability of its functionality. Thus, low-fidelity prototypes are not as visually refined as high-fidelity prototypes. Low-fidelity prototyping is a quick, simple way of evolving a design idea into somewhat more tangible representation of a software product. So there are three examples of low-fidelity prototypes. The first one are sketches. So the sketch prototype are often free-form pen and pencil drawings that map out an initial idea similar to those shown in this example. They are the most rudimentary form of prototype. UX designers typically use sketches to generate ideas and collaborate with the product teams. As you can see here, they just use pen and paper in order to produce sketches. Kailan ba tayo mag-create ng sketches? So, oftentimes, sketches are used to spark discussions about usability and project goals and generate design ideas. Usually, you'll use sketching at the earliest stage of the design. So what are some benefits of sketching? There are many benefits of sketching, but the key advantage is that it is fast. You can create a sketch in just a minute, either with pencil and paper, at a whiteboard, or using software such as Paint. So the next example of low-fidelity prototype is a paper prototype. Paper prototyping is often collaborative and is a good first step before moving on to an interactive prototype. Paper prototypes are not the same thing as sketches. While teams also use them during the earliest phase of the design process, the structure of paper prototypes is more defined than that of set of sketches. While you'll often draw sketches freehand, paper prototypes typically involve using stencils and cardboard to create a more substantial, detailed mock-ups of various web pages or application screens for use during usability testing. When to create paper prototypes? Just like sketches, you'll usually create paper prototypes at the beginning of the design stage. Paper prototypes can be the first step of prototyping or the next step after completing your initial sketches. The benefits of paper prototype is that it is similar to sketching. Creating paper prototypes is fast, easy, inexpensive, and requires no technical knowledge. So the next example of a low-fidelity prototype is the click-through prototype. Click-through prototypes link various screens through hotspots. Click-through prototypes depict the elements on the pages of a website or the screens of an app. They link various screens through hotspots. These prototypes are more advanced versions of low-fidelity prototypes as well as the simplest version of interactive prototypes. So when to create click-through prototypes? While sketches and paper prototypes are great initial steps, click-through prototypes help you to take things one step further. Creating a click-through prototype is a great way of testing product flow early in the design process. The benefits of click-through prototypes is that it is a clickable prototype, more closely mimic a real user experience than sketches and paper prototypes. Thus, they require less imagination on the part of your teammates, while they are more time-consuming to create than their other low-fidelity counterparts. Creating click-through prototypes is much less involved than creating high-fidelity prototypes. Now let's proceed to high-fidelity prototypes. Okay, so high-fidelity prototypes are more aesthetically pleasing and their function is closer to that of the final products. High-fidelity prototypes are more advanced than their low-fidelity counterparts. They are more aesthetically pleasing. You'll typically create high-fidelity prototypes further along in the design process. Once a team has a firm grasp of what they want the finished product to embody, this is where high-fidelity prototypes come in. High-fidelity prototypes are sometimes better for usability testing than low-fidelity prototypes. So we have different examples also of high-fidelity prototypes. Let's talk about the first one. The first one is what we call interactive prototypes. Interactive prototypes, such as shown here, are more advanced version of click-through prototypes that you can create using a prototyping application that supports interactivity but only medium fidelity visual design. In a sense, they are the culmination of the process of sketching, then creating prototypes or click-through prototypes. Interactive prototypes are both clickable and responsive, enabling users to interact with them and see animations in response, and they are more aesthetically pleasing than their low-fidelity prototype precursors. So when will you create interactive prototypes? Because interactive prototypes are more realistic than low-fidelity prototypes, they're better for soliciting feedback and doing usability testing. You'll typically create interactive prototypes later in the design and prototyping process once a product's design and functionality are fairly well established. The benefits of creating interactive prototype is that interactive prototypes look somewhat more realistic than low-fidelity prototypes. They are also clickable and responsive, so they give stakeholders a pretty good idea of how the final product will look and behave. Next, we have the digital prototypes created with prototyping software. This is the most common type of high-fidelity prototype. It lets the UX designers create aesthetically rich, interactive, and even animated product prototypes of a user interface that is almost ready for implementation. When will you create digital prototype? Creating digital prototype only once a product and its flow are well thought out and have been approved by key stakeholders for final testing and implementation because it's quite costly to create. So what are the benefits of digital prototypes? Digital prototypes look but don't behave as close to the final product as possible. However, they can be dynamic, animated, and offer smooth transitions between pages. So the last type of high-fidelity prototype is the coded or HTML CSS prototypes. Creating a coded prototype is more complex because it requires the designer or prototypes to know how to code a certain programming language. These prototypes are the closest to the final design of a product and are the best option for generating user feedback. You will create coded prototypes when you need the look and the behavior of the final product if you want to see the real look and behavior of the final product. A coded prototype should be the final type of prototype you create because coded prototypes are the most realistic and closest to the final product. They are ideal for usability testing. While digital prototypes look but don't behave like the final product, coded prototypes both look and behave as much like the final product as possible. The benefits is that this type of prototypes are neither fast and easy to create nor easy to revise. They are natively responsive so people can view them on phones, tablets, or desktop. Creating coded prototypes is usually less collaborative than creating a low fidelity prototype. However, these prototypes are the very realistic. So, there. The comparison between low fidelity versus the high fidelity prototypes. In low fidelity, you have lesser details, lesser colors, and lesser interaction. While if you go higher, you have more details, more interactions, and more colors. So this is the comparison between, this is the look and feel of how you would transition from a low fidelity prototype up to higher fidelity prototypes. Okay, so the concepts discussed so far are the following. What is prototyping, the low fidelity versus high fidelity prototypes, and the details about low fidelity prototypes as well as the high fidelity prototypes. So that's it for our discussion for today. Do you have any questions? Okay, so if you don't have any questions, thank you so much for listening.